All right, here we go. You came here. When I tell people that I'm an existentialist, I get a lot of responses: suspicion, interest, pity, blank stares. Many assume that existentialists only wear dark clothing and are depressed nihilists. I don't. I'm not. Existentialism helps me both nurture joy and my commitment to ethical humanism, and I want to try to explain why. A couple of caveats before I begin. First, this talk is more about existentialism than about ethical humanism. Sorry. Second, I'm not trying to explain all ethical culture, all existential perspectives. I'm not going to discuss, for example, existentialism's emphasis on action over words, which is at the heart of ethical culture. I just don't have the time to do it all. Third, existentialism need not be the part of anybody's humanism. I'm just trying today to explain why it's a part of my ethical humanism. And fourth, I'm not trying to convince any of you. I'm just trying to be honest with you and with myself. So I'll begin. Honestly, sometimes I like laughing about death. In one of my favorite movies, Play It Again, Sam, Alan is cruising the museum for a date, and he approaches a darkly dressed young woman and says, "It's a lovely Jackson Pollock, isn't it?" She goes, "Yes." He goes, "What does it say to you?" And she launches into this dreary monologue. "It reinstates the negativeness of the universe, the hideous, lonely emptiness of existence, nothingness. The predicament of man forced to live in a barren, godless eternity like a tiny flame flickering in an immense void with nothing but waste, horror, and degradation forming a useless, bleak straitjacket in a black, absurd cosmos." What are you doing Saturday night? Committing suicide. What about Friday night? On one level, I find that very funny. Obviously, on another, it's not funny. On one level, suicide is no laughing matter. 30,000 people a year in this country take their own lives. And it's a tragedy with many victims, some here today. Suicide scarred my family about 10 years ago. And about a decade ago, and in 1933, my great-grandfather, my namesake, Hugh Bancroft is my middle name, he suffered from depression and he took his life in 1933. Now, often suicide is connected with depression. It's a devastating but often treatable condition. According to the National Institutes of Mental Health, more than 90% of those who commit suicide suffer from depression or other mental disorders, often linked to substance abuse. So those in that battle need support and treatment, not philosophy. Those lucky enough not to be in such a battle can be philosophical. Existentialist philosopher Albert Camus said there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is of suicide. Judging whether or not life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. One's answer can have profound consequences. But today I want to separate existentialism from depression, addiction, and suicide. You can be mentally healthy and content, yet still be an existentialist. And plenty of people who are depressed or addicted are not existentialists. Existentialists are often, however, acutely aware of their mortality. They are conscious that they will not always be, that their unique experience will end. Soren Kierkegaard, some call the first existentialist, viewed facing death as the fundamental human challenge. It's the ultimate leveling reality amongst us all. Our existence will disappear in the eternity that stretches on after we die, for all of us. In these stories of Jean-Paul Sartre, characters contemplate their own non-existence. Sartre produces a number of stories where this experience is universal. Death is this immovable barrier, a darkness that both attracts us and repels us. We can't enter into it, but it frames our life. In his story, The Wall, Sartre writes about Juan Mirabal, who's condemned to die. As he contemplates his execution, he imagines that the wall will soon be at his back. He tries to imagine entering into that wall, but he can't. He can't go beyond it. He laments his fate. Quote, "Someone will holler aim, I'll see 8 rifles looking at me. I'll think how I'd like to get inside that wall. I'll push my back against it, every ounce of strength I have, but the wall will stay like a nightmare." Simone de Beauvoir, the writer who put up with Sartre's brooding during their lifelong relationship as a couple, had a healthier attitude about death. She writes, "It's useless to try to integrate life and death, to behave rationally in the presence of something that is not rational. Each must manage as well as he can in the tumult of feelings." In The Ethics of Ambiguity, she writes, "Today we are having a hard time living because we are so bent on outwitting death." Now, I admit I occasionally get caught up in trying to outwit death. I think I did that here about 3 years ago in a platform. Sometimes I dream that my work and my legacy will live on after me, and that helps sometimes. But again, I come back to Woody Allen, who says, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying." Now, that may be the last joke, so I like using humor, not to try to outwit death, but to try to connect with other people who are trying to figure this thing out. It reminds me of 3 friends contemplating their death. And one says, "What would you like to hear in your casket if people gather around you?" And one says, "I'd like to hear them say I was a good family man." The second one says, "I'd like to hear them say he was a good teacher. He made a big difference for a lot of children." And the third says, "I'd like to hear them say, look, he's moving." All right, I looked on the internet for jokes about death. Most of them begin, "So-and-so goes to heaven." Now, I don't think those are jokes about death. To me, that's about living in some far-off place. For me, being honest about death includes putting a period at the end of my last sentence of my story. This existential perspective colors my ethical humanism. It humbles me. It connects me with all other conscious moral creatures as well as it can. And it asks me to live more fully here and now. It infuses my philosophy of life. During my years teaching high school, I read Howard Gardner's work on different multiple intelligences, and he talks about ways we process information, and some of the categories are linguistic or kinesthetic. Currently, he's working on one that he calls existential intelligence, and those who score high on his list enjoy thinking and questioning and thinking about death and life and ultimate realities. And the historical figures that he says would score high on his scale are people like Aristotle, Confucius, Einstein, Emerson, and Plato. So, of course, I want to put myself in that group. Well, Plato says, through the voice of Socrates, "Ordinary people seem not to realize that those who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death." Now, I've tried to apply myself in the right way to philosophy. That's why one winter night, studying in Georgetown University Library, I decided to change directions. I was on my way to a PhD, but I thought if I did get that PhD, I'd probably just end up my entire life writing one academic paper for another after another for people in this ivory tower. And in my heart, doing philosophy right was about talking to day-to-day people in day-to-day activities. I didn't want to count how many angels were on the head of a pin. I wanted to talk about making choices, building relationships, and caring deeply about many things in the short time we have together. I want to do the work of the world, which is as common as mud, and yet full of meaning. Appreciating my limited time helps me do that work. Now, the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, in the Essentials of Spirituality, touches on how contemplating mortality clarifies our ethical perspective. He writes, "The frank facing of death has the effect of sifting out the true values of life and the false, the things that are worthwhile from the things that are not worthwhile, the things that are related to the highest end and those who are related to the lower partial ends. That's true for me. Existentialism helps me sort out my values. It's made clearer my dedication to the worth of all individuals, to the value of ethical relationships, and to the importance of social justice, the three most important values of my ethical humanism. But let me descend a little further down into existentialism. Some of the vocabulary they use is obviously depressing. Let's take the 3 A's: abandonment, anguish, and absurdity. Cheery. Sartre and other existentialists use the term abandonment to describe the modern human condition. For most, it represented the condition of having been abandoned by God. The growing atheism of the 20th century, along with the horrors of war and alienation, only convinced some, more people, that God was dead. No more so than Nietzsche, who blamed human consciousness and genius for this murder. He writes, a favorite passage of college philosophy majors, "Whither is God? I shall tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. Do we not hear anything, yet the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything, yet of God's decomposition? God too decomposes. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." Now, I want to make clear that while there's often a strong tie between some existentialists and atheism, they're not necessarily connected. And that's very important to me. Remember that the first existentialist, Kierkegaard, was a Christian. All existentialists, however, agree that we have been abandoned by certainty. We no longer can be certain. Between consciousness and all else is a huge chasm. We stand, as it were, on a brink of an abyss. We have to make the leap alone. We have to do it without a guide. And in this way, we are alone. The second A, anguish, arises when we appreciate that we must choose, aware that we don't know nothing for certain. So Sartre offers the example trotted out all the time about Abraham having to sacrifice his son, asked apparently by an angel of God to do so. On the surface, the horror is that he has two choices, neither of them very attractive. He either can disobey God or kill his own son. Now, a fanatic might rationalize this by saying that there's a glorious afterlife and somehow my son will be better off there and pretty soon I'll end there with him anyway and I'll do God's will. But I think Abraham was more typical than fanatic, so he can't rationalize it that way. Abraham cannot know for sure. Should the angel be real and truly expressing God's wishes, that would be one thing. In killing his son, he could think of himself as a noble soldier of Christ, steadfast in allegiance, sacrificing for a higher cause. The anguish in that case might be somewhat overcome by understanding how it sits into a grand plan. Now, I find that unattractive enough, right? I lost my name. He has no way of knowing whether this is an angel of God or not, so he has to choose. The true anguish arises there. What if it was a devil or a hallucination? Then the sacrifice would not only be a sin before God, but it would also cause him to lose his precious son. Is the angel real? Is God real? Small in stature, limited in knowledge, he still must decide and accept full responsibility. And that's true for all of us in this room, for every decision we make. Even if we can consult a God or an expert or a friend, it's ultimately up to us to choose who to ask, who to trust, and what to do. So this often leads to the third A, absurdity. Abandoned to anguish alone and uncertain, we just don't know when our intentions match reality. If Abraham thinks he's killing his son for some divine purpose of an all-powerful God, but there is no God or purpose, intentions don't match reality. Camus offers a more concrete example. He says, if I see a man armed with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider the act to be absurd. It's the basis of most comedy. but solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and reality he will encounter, of the contradiction, I notice, between the true strength and the aim he has in view. So that disproportion between intention and reality is the absurd. Now others may say, no, the absurd is a single thing. It's simply the meaninglessness of existence. This singular fact means that there's no necessity, no inherent reason for the way things are, that reality could be different and it wouldn't really matter. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician, has put it this way: when I consider the short duration of my life swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the little space I fill, and can even see engulfed in the infinite immensity of space of which I am ignorant, and which knows me not, I am frightened, and astonished at being here rather than there, now rather than then. But in my experience, the world in and of itself is not absurd. This is why. The lack of objective meaning, in my mind, is not absurd. The absurd only arises from this particular clash: the meaninglessness of reality and the human insistence on meaning. The meaninglessness of reality and our insistence on meaning. Camus embraces this version. He says that the absurd doesn't point towards self-annihilation, towards extinction, towards suicide. It's not a threat to human survival, it's a creation of human survival. Only by living our life does the absurd live. The issue is not, according to Camus, whether the absurd should lead us to suicide, but rather the absurd is only possible if we choose to live. And he urges us to keep the absurd alive. He writes, living in experience a particular fate is accepting it fully. No one will live this fate knowing it to be absurd unless he does everything to keep before him that absurd brought to light by consciousness. Negating one of the terms of the opposition on which he lives is to elude the problem. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Despite the lack of meaning in the world in and of itself, the absurd gives us an opportunity to create meaning. If one opts for suicide, the absurd's collapsed. Camus goes on, he says, the absurd is born of this confrontation between human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. In this way, suicide settles the absurd. It engulfs the absurd in the same death. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. I know that in order to keep the absurd alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It escapes life to the extent that it is simultaneously awareness and rejection of death. This revolt gives life its value. Spread over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. He concludes, to a man devoid of blinders, there's no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. There's no finer sight of intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. Consciousness wrestling with what's beyond it, with a reality that will continue on without it, with what's beyond that wall. Well, transcendence meant a lot to Felix Adler. In his project to reconstruct religion, he discarded many of the traditional religious paradigms. He rejected the belief in a personal God, the belief in an afterlife. He denied the existence of some reality above and beyond this one, some call heaven. But he didn't give up the idea of transcendence. He lived in this world, full of flaws and suffering and meanness. When he founded the New York Society for Ethical Culture in 1876, this country was full of suffering, meanness, and flaws that exuded through wars, capitalism, shallow materialism. And he was worried that the new sciences of physics or biology or economics would only describe what is, not what could be. What mattered most to Adler was what could be, what is not now, but might be in the future. This was Adler's transcendence, and it's mine. It was in this ethical sphere that Adler expressed his transcendence. He said that the animal self is tied to the world. The moral self, however, imagines a better world. Adler was frustrated by people who saw only the world as it is, where people just made do and got by. It was frustrating because he could imagine a better world. And like my sense of existentialism, in Adler's perspective, it's only in the dark that light shines. He writes, "The ideal which I have enunciated has been accused of overemphasizing frustration, of leading to a depressing view of life. To stand on the brink, as it were, of the finite, to look upon that solemn serenity of the external order, is, if that is depressing, then the accusation is just." He continues, "But frustration is only the stepping stone. The accent of my view of life is on that which lies beyond frustration, frustration being the inevitable means to the holiest vision." We're not simply given this holiest vision that Adler talks about. What we're given is our biological existence. As a physical organism, we're finite and flawed, but we also have an ethical, intellectual existence that allows for human freedom and human creativity. Jose Ortega, a Spanish existentialist, talks about this distinction between the animal side and what he says is our essential humanness. He says, "Man's being is made up of such strange stuff as to be partly akin to nature and partly not, at once natural and extranatural, a kind of ontological centaur, half immersed in nature, half transcending it. What is natural in him is realized by itself. It presents no problems. This is precisely why man does not consider it his true being. His extranational part, on the other hand, is not there from the outset. It is but an aspiration, a project of life. And this we feel to be our true being. We call it our personality, our self." So this existential project of life, of creating ourself, or that part of us which we have most responsibility, is a part of existentialism. While we're not responsible for our mortality, we are responsible for being aware of it in a way that is productive. We're not responsible for the hand we're dealt. We are responsible for how we play the game. It's not always easy to keep the absurd alive. Psychotherapist Viktor Frankl, who was the seminal figure in existential analysis, cared for many of his clients who saw the meaninglessness and dark side of life. But rather than giving them specific solutions, Frankl challenged them to come up with their own meaning within their life as a whole. The good and the bad, the light and the dark. Frankl's approach was called logotherapy, and it approaches the life as a whole, where ultimately we are free to make choices. We can't deny the circumstances of our life or our own animal nature, but we can choose how to respond to them. On the website of the Viktor Frankl Institute, the mission says that human freedom and responsibility challenges individuals to bring forth the best possible in themselves and in the world by perceiving and realizing the meaning of the moment in each and every situation. I think that's a beautiful, creative, and invigorating challenge, and that is at the heart of ethical culture, bringing our best. The most fun I ever had responding to this challenge was with my good friend Ken Knisley. Ken and I both cut our philosophical teeth teaching philosophy to teenagers. We both savored the eagerness with which teens asked existential questions as they came into our classroom as their own autonomous individuals trying to tear themselves out of a context of their parents, their families, and a culture that asked them to conform all the time. Ken and I talked a lot about how young people need to feel free and to break from authority. It's part of their adolescent rebellion for sure, but on a deeper level, it's a cry of frustration over a growing realization, or at least it was for me. After having been comforted by parents and a soft life, they confront the world alone. To this, again, they're both attracted and repelled. They see the truth behind the words of Martin Luther. the father of the Protestant Reformation, when he says every man must do two things alone. He must do his own believing and his own dying. And I think many teens embrace this freedom and limitation with energy. At times, both Ken and I appreciated how desperately our students wanted to be in relationship, however, engaged with communities of trust and respect. I mean, they wanted to make their own decisions, they wanted to face death alone, but they wanted to do with others. And that's, I think, a paradox that we all feel. It pushed Ken and I to respect our students' autonomy and independence. But we urged them to stay connected, to make new friends, but remember their family, to create their future, but remember their past. For years, Ken and I worked on this together as we embraced this paradox, whether it was by producing his television show, No Dogs or Philosophers Allowed, or when we were crawling underground in Virginia trying to film our twisted version of Plato's allegory of the cave. We tried to mix dark humor and wisdom and offer it to the world, or at least we tried. My faith in ethical humanism has been fed by this existential paradox. Ethical culture has evolved and is still evolving, but consistent throughout its history is one version of this paradox. We are both autonomous and related. Autonomous and related. We both live and die alone and in community. Of course, I'm a unique individual, the only one who can make my own choices. I'm the only one who knows what it's like to be me, and you're the only one who knows what it's like to be you. Of course, only I should take responsibility for my choices. But at the same time, I'm also related. I'm a husband, a father, a teacher, an ethical culture leader. All these identities exist only in relationship with other people. I'm defined in part by an intimate and organic relationships with my wife, my children, my students, my friends, in and out of ethical culture. And I'm attracted to ethical humanism because it allows me to accept this paradox, to respect and acknowledge my alienation and my relationships, of what will die with my consciousness and what will live on in the hearts and minds of those who care for me. Aware of my limits and what confronts me like a wall beyond which I can't reach doesn't keep me boxed in. I still can transcend this solitude through the many relationships with people that I care for. I find it deliciously real to express my existential leanings with you. I hope you feel somewhat benefited by it. And I'm heartened to know that many of you are trying to do the same, in your own way, in your own words. As I move on to a conclusion, I want to share one Buddhist metaphor that I think is a little lighter than some of the ones I've shared. It reflects this existential perspective. It's the one about how we're each a wave in an immense ocean. We rise out of an indistinct sea, swell, and crest, declaring ourselves to the world as unique and powerful, and eventually we crash back and fade away. Now, the lesson some Buddhists make of this metaphor is that we are all simply an illusion, we're insignificant. I get it. But I have a more romantic existentialism that leads me to celebrate that wave, to glory in it. If death confronts us, I don't think it has to distract us from being the wave we are now. In fact, it can drive us to be more of that wave, to crest higher. It certainly did so for Ken. Ken, as you can probably guess, died a few years ago after being diagnosed only a few weeks before he died with an aggressive cancer. Right up to the end, he demonstrated a love of life strong enough to face death both realistically and creatively. In a blog that I hadn't read for about 5 years, that he wrote from his hospital bed, he was the quintessential existentialist. He said, "I enjoyed teaching existentialism to my high school students. I count it as a success if I can get them by that usual shallow thrill that adolescents feel reading and discussing Kierkegaard and Camus, and get them to at least glimpse what I always thought of as a distant light in the fog. That sharp, enlivening flavor of human existing, understood without all the gauzy narcotics we so efficiently feed ourselves. The encounter with one's mortality that somehow jumpstarts a move towards authenticity. Ken asks then, is it always a distant light for someone living a life full of bills and kids and schedules and neat plans for the next 5 years? So it seemed to me as I started out to work out the implications of my condition. Because I felt that that light was all around me, like being in a space starkly lit by television lights from above, around, or underneath. I found myself thinking, how can I improve my presentation of fear and loathing with this experience? Then that perky thought disappeared into the drowning light. Out of that light, I really am trying not to pull any more words. Well, Ken was a great speaker and listener, but he couldn't help pulling out any more words. He continues. This is not some unique experience in the general scheme of things. Keeping this in mind does reveal one's vanities, usefully humbling. But sharing this condition, the news of this condition, also has revealed to me how many people care. My faith in ethical humanism celebrates the beauty of both our unique ways in this vast ocean. There's room for both self-worth and humility. And in the end, we experience these alone, and we experience these together. Thank you.